Hi, welcome to this final sneaky little slide of mine on the topic of materiality and practice in anthropology. So this is a kind of little extra that I've added at the end because the lecture this week really has been focused on Marxist approaches in anthropology and Marx-inspired approaches in anthropology, which, as we saw, have as their fundamental premise the idea that the material level of human existence is the most real and determining level. So social and cultural phenomena that anthropologists are interested in can be explained with reference to that baseline materiality that can formulate and furnish the terms of explanation that anthropologists might produce in order to account for the kinds of phenomena that they're interested in, right? Now, there are other ways in which anthropologists have taken a great deal of interest in materiality and materials and the role of objects, things, artifacts in people's lives that are not as hard-edgedly materialist as Marxism and Marxist-inspired approaches in anthropology are, but nevertheless lay great store in the study of the materiality and the material aspects of human lives in order to understand the constitutive role that object, artifacts, things play in the way that we live our lives as human beings. And that if, as anthropologists, we're interested in how humans operate and live their lives, we need, therefore, to also be interested in materials and things, because these are constitutive of what we get up to as human beings, right? So I call these approaches versions of soft materialism, as opposed to the hard materialism of Marxism. And the distinction I'm using is precisely that while for Marx and Marxist approaches, the material level is determining, furnishes the basis for causal explanations of social and cultural phenomena. For these softer materialisms, the material is constitutive. It's not determining, but it's constitutive. It forms part of what we need to study in order to get a full picture of social and cultural and human phenomena that we're interested in as anthropologists. So I've got here a selection of a few approaches that I think are examples of what I'm calling soft materialism. And I've put a few pictures up of the people that are, or some of the people that are associated with these approaches. I noticed that my own picture as I speak, the film, is overlapping and superimposed on the face of my esteemed and dear colleague Daniel Miller. Danny Miller is a big figure in our department, as many of you will already know. He's one of the people that I want to talk about, and of course my image is covering his. So I encourage you to go to the PowerPoint that's on Moodle that doesn't have my image on it, and you can see Danny's face in its full glory. And in fact, I want to start with Danny and really his role and the book that he wrote, an edited book that he came out with in 2005 called Materialities, in which a number of people from our department write, really to kind of articulate the distinctive contribution of something that UCL is particularly famous for, which is material culture studies. And Danny is one of the leading figures of that. And I'm quoting from Danny's introduction, where he has this very pithy formulation, which I think really captures it really well, which is the things people make people, right? So the focus here in this material culture studies tradition is on looking at how material things are constituted as a part of how people come to express themselves and make sense of the world in which they live. Right? What's really interesting about material culture studies, and not least in the work of Danny Miller himself, is the emphasis on consumption rather than production. So if in Marxism the emphasis was on labor, the materiality of labor and the production of things, for Danny and for others in material culture studies inspired by him, consumption is the key terrain that we look at, because it's how people deploy and use things in order to constitute their lives as they are that is of interest? Why do I choose to take my child to eat in McDonald's and not to have a picnic in the park? And what that says about me, about my relationship with my child, and how McDonald's as a choice, you know, Big Mac or whatever, my relationship with that kind of consumptive context plays into broader life projects, is the kind of thing that you know, the UCL Material Culture Studies approach would encourage us to do. Having said that, UCL Material Culture Studies is extremely varied, and there's only one strand of thinking within it, but I think it's a particularly important one. So if you think people are important, you have to think that things and the things that people use and consume and engage with are also important, because those things are important to people. See, so it goes like that. Anthropologists are interested in people, people are interested in things, therefore anthropologists have to be also interested in things. That's the idea. Another soft materialism that I've listed here as a possible approach that you may take an interest in can be kind of tagged with that word semiotics, the study of signs. So studying the world as a system of signs and people creating systems of signs. Look, for example, at phenomena such as fashion or advertising. What kind of messages do we send to each other by the choices that we make in what we wear, or the kind of products and commodities that we use? In some ways, the study of the Kabila house that I presented as an example of Bourdieu's practice theory is also an example of a semiotic approach, because if you remember, in that study, Pierre Bourdieu is looking at the Kabila house as a system of signification, right? So important distinctions in Kabila culture, such as the distinction between the male and the female, or light and dark, or high and low, are symbolized and made legible in the space of the Kabila house. And that's a kind of semiotic analysis. And often semiotics is associated also with structuralism. We'll talk about structuralism more next week, but these kinds of binary oppositions and distinctions in terms of which people make sense of themselves and of each other, and their expression in systems of signs is also an interest for structuralism. The figure of Chris Tilley, another esteemed colleague in the material culture group in our department, the man on the top left corner of the slide, doing what he most likes doing, which is digs in the British countryside. He's written a great deal that takes the kind of approach that combines semiotic and structuralist approaches, as well as the next approach that I wanted to highlight, which is the phenomenological approach, which also is another way in which materiality has featured in anthropological research, inspired by philosophers of what's called phenomenology, the philosophical study of that founds philosophical insight on a description of human experience, phenomenology, phenomena, the appearances, the experiences that human beings are able to entertain. So the idea here, which Chris Tilley also has developed greatly in his work, both as an anthropologist and as an archaeologist, is that human beings should not be classified in a category as distinct of materials and nature, but rather are actually, their experience is one of continuity with artifacts, materials, nature, landscape, and so on. We are embedded in the world, in the material world, which is something that, of course, as I've said, Marx would also agree with. But the conclusion that phenomenology draws from this is that in order to understand human beings, based on the experience of being human, one has to overcome these kinds of theoretical oppositions between the material and the ideal, for example, and really look at the imbrication of these two levels. Being in the world is the way that we want to characterize the experience of humans making their way through the world in life. We're embedded, we're dwelling in the world, and we should study human beings in continuity with the world rather than in opposition to it, for example, as an object upon which humans might take a perspective, as we saw, right? So the locus of meaning lies in that imbrication between human and world, and the place where that happens is in the human body. So phenomenologists lay great emphasis in the study of embodiment, the ways in which human culture is embodied. And again, Pierre Bourdieu is also inspired by phenomenology when he develops his notion of habitus as an embodied way of inscribing ideology and of reproducing it, right? Tim Ingold, Chris Tilly, Thomas Zordas, these are all figures that are very important in phenomenological approaches. Another approach that exemplifies what I'm calling soft materialism is really something that's been developing with great vigor in the past 20, 30 years in conversation with a discipline that in many ways is contiguous, closely related with anthropology, which is science and technology studies. The great figure here, or two great figures here, would be Donna Haraway, the lady with the dog just underneath Chris Tilly, and Bruno Latour, the gentleman with a scarf in the top right hand corner of the slide. They're both STS scholars, although in many ways, certainly in the case of Donna Haraway, who's also a great feminist scholar, she transcends STS in a number of ways. And one of the lessons of people who study science and technology as a field, as those two scholars have done and many others, Antonia Walford in our department would be a good example of an anthropologist who is in close dialogue with STS. One of the conclusions that they draw is that precisely the imbrication of people and things, the ways in which one becomes a function of the other, means that we need a new theoretical vocabulary in order to talk about human experience, one that goes beyond this humanistic premise that somehow humans are a category unto themselves, and rather talks, for example, about cyborgs or hybrids, or talks about activities that are typically, or capacities and activities that are typically associated with human beings, find them in non-human beings, in systems, in objects, in animals, in spirits, right? So, for example, one idea that's been debated greatly in the past couple of decades is associated with an anthropologist working just down the road at the LSE until he died far too early in the late 1990s, Alfred Gell, who again has had a major influence in our department, mainly through Suzanne Kuchler and Chris Pinney, both of whom were his students. In his great book, Art and Agency, Gell argues that agency is something that we can find not just in people, but also in objects. Objects, properly understood, can operate upon other objects and upon people in a way that is analogous to the kind of agency that human beings are meant to be exercising. So therefore, if things can be seen as agents, then the distinction between things and people begins to become compromised. So this is another kind of soft materialist approach that seeks to redistribute conceptually distinctions between people and things, freedom and necessity, the material and the spiritual, and so on, right? And a final approach is really closely allied with this, which is a kind of tendency, and in my own work I do quite a lot of that, but I think the great figure that I would associate this mostly with is Marilyn Strathern, the lady beneath Bruno Latour in the middle of the right, smiling. Anthropologists who have sought to use their ethnography as a position from which to destabilize the distinctions that Western philosophy has taken for granted or built, such as the distinction between the material and the ideal, or indeed the phenomenological critique of that itself could be criticized based on ethnography. So to give you an example, Marilyn Strathern's great famous book, The Gender of the Gift, uses ethnography of ceremonial gift exchange in Papua New Guinea, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, to destabilize the way that we conceptualize what it is to be a person, but also what it is to be a thing. Because the gifts that Melanesian people in the highlands, the people in the highlands of Melanesia exchange, in many ways destabilize and render blurry the distinction between a person and a thing. This is an argument that has its origins way back in the work of Marcel Mauss, of course, who said something similar about gifts, in a sense having a spirit, right? So Strathern takes these kinds of Morsian insights and develops them into a kind of radical reconceptualization of some of the most basic concepts of anthropology, such as the very concept of the person, but also the very concept of the object, right? So she develops a new analytical vocabulary inspired or instigated by the ways in which Melanesian ways of living and of exchanging gifts and of all sorts of other things um, force us to rethink these fundamental premises. So again, the ways in which local conceptions and practices that have to do with the way people use objects become a vantage point from which anthropological theory shifts its own premises and hopefully opens new windows of possibility for thinking, right? And for conceptualizing and understanding. So these are some of the radical potentials that anthropologists' engagements with materials have produced. I think I'm going to leave it there for this week. I think I've really given you perhaps more than I should in terms of exhausting you with all these clips, but I hope you've had something, you've got something out of them, and I really look forward to discussing them with you in our Q&A sessions, in our seminars and so on. So see you then.